Well, everyone, welcome to July's Forest Specialist Series. I'm Kelly, the San Juan Mountains Association's Visitor Information Coordinator for the Rio Grande National Forest. This Forest Specialist Series is a once-monthly online program. We share Rio Grande National Forest information with our local community, and it's hosted in partnership with Rio Grande National Forest and the San Juan Mountains Association. Tonight, we've got a 40-minute presentation with our specialist, and then there'll be question and answer session. We will have, same thing, housekeeping. Please stay on mute unless you're asking a question. In order to ask a question, you can raise your hand in the reactions section of the bar down below, or you can also put your question in the chat, which you can access with the little speech bubble. Our door prize tonight is kind of a few things. We've got our trees booklet. It just talks about some of the trees native to the forests of Colorado. And then we have a couple of stickers. We've got a Rio Grande National Forest sticker. We have a little Colorado road trip sticker. It's a VW bus, and it has Rio Grande National Forest on it. And then, because we're talking about plants tonight, we've got our Colorado wildflower flag sticker that I will send out to everybody. If you would like to be in the drawing, go ahead and put your name in the chat and I'll get you in that. So that, I think, oh, also, if you're not already on the the email list, if you want to be on the email list for upcoming events, upcoming Forest Specialist Series events, put your email in the address in the chat. And you can do that by clicking on the waiting room or the participants and click on the VIS coordinator or San Juan Mountains Association. That's me. And just put your email there. That way, not everybody gets to see it. Okay, so we're going to turn the time now to Rachel Hosna. She is our specialist for the month. She works here with the Rio Grande National Forest, and she specializes in botany. So take it away, Rachel. You're going to have to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
And you can see my screen.
Oh, we are all good.
Oh. You can see my presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started then. My name is Rachel Hosna. I oversee the botany and invasive programs for the Rio Grande National Forest. I really appreciate Kelly and Greg for letting me give a talk. I just celebrated my second year here on the forest, but I've still got a lot of plants to learn. So these presentations always give me a chance to take a deeper dive. But just a disclaimer that I'm by no means an expert in alpine plants, and this talk will be pretty basic. But today, I'm going to focus on our alpine plant communities, which I think are some of our most vibrant but also fragile habitats. The Rio has approximately 1,800 species of plants, and I'm not sure exactly how many of those grow up in the alpine, but my point is that I'm only going to be able to cover a snippet of species. So here we go. Just a quick alpine overview. So alpine or alpine tundra, that's the general name for the ecosystem we're going to be focusing on. In Colorado, the alpine ecosystem covers only about 3% of the state, but most of that is managed by the U.S. Forest Service. So in Colorado, the alpine occurs between approximately 11,500 feet to the highest point of the state, over 14,000 feet. And it's essentially the area above tree line. So just some of the conditions that alpine plants are growing in, most obviously are very low winter temperatures, but also a short growing season. So just thinking about how late it takes snow to melt in the spring and how early it can come in the fall and winter. They also experience very shallow soils, and it can take many, many years to develop even an inch of soil up in the Alpine. These plants are occurring like at, on, or near mountaintops where bedrock is at close or surface. They're also growing in low nutrient conditions and experience very high winds that can desiccate their plant tissues and also blow soil particles away. And then they're also experiencing very high ultraviolet radiation in the sun. So some adaptations that they have for growing in these environments include thick, waxy leaves, which help them withstand desiccation from the wind. They often have hairy stems or hairy plant parts that can help with desiccation from the wind as well, and also help protect them from high ultraviolet radiation. The color can also help them up in the Alpine. So red and blue pigments can help convert light into heat. So plants that have red or blue colors, that's helping them adapt to the high alpine environment. And then also deep tap roots help them explore for water and nutrients and also help anchor plants in. So even though the alpine areas may get up to 60 inches of precipitation in the form of snow, thin soils mean that they don't retain water very well. So that makes them susceptible to erosion, particularly for plants growing in what we'll talk about later, fell field habitats. And then finally, many plants are mat forming or low growing to help reduce impacts from high winds and to help them retain heat and moisture. So the broader alpine ecosystem in Colorado, the alpine zones account for about 20% of stream flow, soaking in snow melt and releasing it downstream. And then, of course, alpine vegetation supports a variety of wildlife and pollinator species, including pika, marmots, bighorn sheep, etc. Here's a cute little marmot from the Park Service website. So just some of the types of plant communities you might see on the Rio. The first that we're going to talk about is fell field. Fell is Gaelic for stone, so it essentially means a field of stone. These plants are kind of in the toughest growing conditions with very little soil, high winds that can dry the plants out and blow particles of soil away. So these are the open rocky spaces, often really scoured by winds with those shallow soils, sparse vegetation. But over time, these communities can give way to turf communities. So alpine turf, these areas have more developed soils, but still very little organic material. They're often on gentler slopes and have a bit more consistent water supply. And then finally, we have our wet meadows. So these are kind of depressions in the topography that allow for water to be held. This is where we see some of our alpine willow species, and often midsummer is the height of bloom in these communities. So here's a photograph near Mesa Mountain on the Divide Ranger District at about 12,500 feet. On the left, kind of, and also in the foreground, you can see a bunch of rocks and boulders. These are our fell field plant communities. And then further in the distance there on the right, and even in the very foreground of this photo, you can see quite a few grasses that make up part of our alpine turf. And then if you squint your eyes just right, you might be able to see a little speck of blue with a dark ring of green vegetation. That's where our wet meadows are. So all of these plant communities kind of exist in a mosaic in our alpine. So here's just an example of an alpine fell community. It's a bit different than, pure bedrock or scree fields. Primarily in the alpine fell is distinguished by these small cushion plants who are just so cute and create this diverse community of plants that grow in such close quarters. Alpine scree fields can also grow plants. We're not going to talk about them too much because they're often only have about 10% cover of vegetation. But species like the Colorado blue columbine, sky pilot, and some of our native thistles often really like scree fields. Alpine fell plants typically flower a bit earlier, so as early as June. Here's just an example of a turf community on the Rio. So on the left, we have Antora Meadows with Antora Peak in the background, and to the right, we have Snow Mesa. So in these turf communities, we typically get rhizomatous sedges and forbs. And as I mentioned before, oftentimes these different types of plant communities are all intermingled in a greater matrix of the alpine tundra. This is a photo of Tobacco Lake on the Conejos Peak Ranger District at about 12,200 feet. So here we can see that snow melt is feeding into this high alpine lake where we have a bunch of willows and other water-loving species growing. If you can barely see, this trail is going through a bit of scree, and then maybe we have some turf communities up on these gentler slopes on the hillside with, I'm sure, some fell field mixed in as well. Okay, so let's start diving into some of the plants. I'm going to focus on forbs. They're the most showy superstars that you're likely to cue in on. So the first in the top left, we have moss campion. It can be in the turf or the fell field community. This species occurs throughout high mountains in North America and even into Europe. And we see here in this photo, it's a really great species for pollinators. I love that this little butterfly and bee are just side by side, getting in some floral resources. To the top right, we have Rocky Mountain nailwort. It's often an indicator of alpine fell field communities. It has very inconspicuous yellow flowers growing amidst its succulent leaves. It definitely made me do a double take to notice those tiny little flowers. The next, I think, might be one of my new favorite plants. The bottom left is American false candy tuft, which is just such a fun common name, as well as its scientific name, Smolowskia americana. It has white to light purple petals, which is personally how I cued in on it because purple is my favorite color. It also grows a bit taller than most of the super tiny cushion plants around it, which helps it stand out a little bit more. This one's really interesting because it grows from North America, in North America from British Columbia south to Colorado and Utah, but it also grows in China and Mongolia. And so you might be scratching your head like, what? But one theory that I read is that, and this is similar to some other species, but one theory is that these now very widely disconnected areas were once contiguous during the Tertiary period before being split during the Pleistocene. So a similar story of glaciation and changes over geologic time applies to a few other of these species that are found beyond North America. And then finally on this slide, we have alpine phlox. There's a couple different species you might find, which can also be in the turf or the fell field communities. All right, some more alpine forbs. So in the top left, we have alpine avens. It can be in the turf or the fell field community. Colorado Public Radio did a really nice special on this species, and it talked about how alpine avens contains a lot of bitter tannins, so it typically isn't favored by animals, but pika have used it as a preservative for other plants in their little hay pile stashes. And sometimes they'll actually eat the flowers after the avens has been sitting long enough that the tannins have broken down a bit, which I just find fascinating. I'm not sure how they figured that one out. To the top right, we have the American bistort. This one is very showy, really cool. It's often found in the turf community, and it's not exclusive to the alpine. So you can commonly see this one in subalpine meadows and other wet areas. I read that it's sometimes called miner's toes because the flowers do not have a very pleasant odor. I've actually never, so I'll have to try that next time, see what I think. We're going to skip to the sky pilot on the bottom right. Sky pilot really likes to grow in scree fields and also fell field. Viscosum, it's as part of its scientific name, refers to its sticky leaves. And this one you'll likely see on south-facing slopes where the snow melts a bit early and the soils warm up quicker. And then finally, we have the alpine forget-me-not, which I want to do just a little bit deeper of a dive into. So this photo, I think, actually came from Brandon, who's on this call, our wildlife biologist on the Swatch Ranger District. So Alpine forget-me-not, Erythrachium nanum, depending on what source you're looking at, what flora you're looking at, this can have a number of different scientific names. Its roots are in Greek, so erion means wool, trichos means hairs, and nanum is Greek for diminutive, tiny, dwarf. So it's little woolly hairs. It has these just vibrant blue flowers, and then, of course, those hairy leaves. It's mat forming, but it's not clonal. So it has one taproot and multiple stems that just grow close to the ground. This one you can find in the Rocky Mountains of North America, but also in the European Alps and parts of Asia. It only grows up to about 4 inches tall. And so there's actually been a lot of research on this species, or a very closely related variety of this species that grows in the European Alps. And so one study there looked at the survival of this plant during the ice ages, and found evidence for a theory that these plants probably survived in pockets of unglaciated areas. And then when the glaciers receded, these plants recolonized neighboring areas. It's all very complicated genetics that they did, but it's really interesting to think about that even here on the Rio for a species that can be found, all the way on the Sangres west to the Continental Divide. And then there was another study looking at the age of these plants and found that some of them can live to be 35 to 40 years old, and that a single cushion that you might look at could contain up to 25 individuals. So that's really interesting. I wonder how much of that is true for the species that we have here in North America. And it can be very variable in that it can have very well-developed stems, like you see on the right-hand side, or it can lie very close to the ground. All right, some more alpine forbs. So if you were at my talk last year, you might remember the species in the top left here, growing taller and beefier than most of the alpine vegetation around it. The funky thistle is a fairly newly discovered species. Jennifer Ackerfield, who's the author of the Colorado Flora and botanist extraordinaire, did some research after realizing that the more common mountain thistle had quite a bit of variation across its range. So after a lot of research, including genetics work, the funky thistle was described as a new species, and you can find it growing in the Alpine, both in the Sangres and the South San Juan Mountains. Its name is, it was named after Jennifer Ackerfield's, one of her mentors, but its name is pretty perfect for this pretty crazy looking plant. There are also a few other native species of thistle that can grow in the Alpine. So for those of us who kind of always have one eye open for bad, noxious weeds, please don't pull these Alpine thistles. Yeah, they can definitely look out of place there, but when in doubt, just take a photo and maybe put it on iNaturalist, or you can send it to me. In the top right, we have Perry's lousewort, Pedicularis perryi. Pedicularis is a group of plants that are root hemiparasites. So they have green leaves and they can photosynthesize, but their roots can actually tap into neighboring plants to capture nutrients and water. And I read that the common name is lousewort because people thought it gave livestock lice when they ate it, which is kind of interesting. It's very closely related to elephant heads, which is a pretty showy plant you might also see here on the Rio, and a number of other common pedicularis species that are more common at lower elevations. In the bottom left, we have Castanea. There's two different species you might see in the Alpine, Castanea rexifolia and the closely related Castanea haydenii. They're both kind of this pink, purplish magenta, and there's just some slight differences. Haydenii only grows about 5 inches tall. Rexifolia can be up to 10 inches tall. Haydenii is usually a lighter pink versus rexifolia, which is kind of a deeper magenta. And then something interesting about all paintbrush species is that that really showy part that you see is not actually the flower. It's a leafy bract and the sepals. the flower itself is often a very boring kind of green color. And paintbrushes are another root hemiparasite, just like pedicularis. And then finally, the dwarf clover. There's a few different alpine clover species you could encounter on the Rio, and they can be in the turf or the fellfield communities. These are also often mat forming, so they can be found cozying up to their little alpine friends. Okay, so alpine grasses and sedges aren't as showy as their forb and shrub counterparts. They can often be very difficult to tell apart and identify, but I didn't want to completely ignore them because they're really important food sources and they help hold these fragile soils in place. So this is my quick nod to some of the common species in the alpine turf community. First is tufted hairgrass, Deschampsia cespitosa. This species is not exclusive to the alpine, and you will commonly see it at lower elevations and wetter places. Carex elenoides is a very common alpine sedge. Remember that sedges have edges. Next, we have Festuca brachyphylla, which is just the shortleaf fescue. And then finally, Carex myoceroides, which is another common alpine sedge. And then finally, our alpine willows. So to the far left is the snow willow, which really is typically restricted to the alpine. And unlike the other two species, it is very low growing. So it's usually less than 6 inches tall. Snow willow is the larval host plant to the federally endangered Uncompahgre fritillary butterfly. The larvae rely on the willow while the adults can forage nectar from a variety of alpine wildflowers. In the middle, we have Salix glauca. Glauco is Greek for gray or bluish gray, which in this case refers to kind of the waxy coating on the underside of the leaves. It grows in alpine and subalpine meadows, and it's usually less than 3.5 feet tall. And then finally, we have Salix planifolia, the tea-leaved willow. It's another one that can grow both in alpine and subalpine wet meadows or fens. It's typically a bit taller, usually about 6 feet at lower elevations, but then usually less than 4 feet in the alpine. And this one can actually be confused with a bunch of other willows. So if you're interested in willows, there's an awesome, relatively new book called Willows of Colorado, Their Ecology and Identification. That's available from a variety of sources, and it has like so many good resources for identifying willows at different stages. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the rare plants on the Rio Grande that grow up in the alpine. So about 40% of our rare plants grow in the alpine. Not all of them are fully restricted to elevations above timberline, but more often of our known records occur. So the first one we're going to talk about is probably our rarest. It's the stonecrop gilia. It is fully restricted to alpine. It often occurs on rocky, barren slopes. It's endemic to the San Juan Mountains. And it is a G1S1. So G refers to a global rank of rarity, and S refers to a state rank of rarity. And the number assigned to the global or state rank indicates how rare it is. So a 1 is critically imperiled. So that means at very high risk of extinction due to a number of different reasons. And this plant was actually thought to be extinct, but then in 1995, it was rediscovered with another sighting in 2007. And I think there's been a couple more recently. And 98% of the known occurrences of this species are on U.S. Forest Service lands. So some plant characteristics are the dark blue, kind of purple flowers. The leaves are entire, so they don't have any little teeth or lobes, and they're succulent. And this is a biennial. So thinking back to those adaptations we talked about, it has this long taproot that helps it search for water through this gravelly, rocky soil. Next, we have the Colorado tansy aster. So this one can grow as low as 8,500 feet up to as high as 12,500 feet. It really likes, again, those gravelly areas from mountain parks up to the tundra to the alpine. It grows in central Wyoming all the way down to Colorado. It typically flowers from July to August. And this one is a G3S3. And so 3 means that it's vulnerable, it's at moderate risk of becoming locally extinct. Some plant characteristics that has these very vibrant magenta flowers. So thinking back both for this species and the previous one and the adaptations that we talked about, these colors have those anthocyanin pigments that help these plant tissues warm up in this cold environment. So magenta flowers, has a hairy stem and pretty toothed leaves. Next, we have our group of rare alpine drabas. These are our whitlow grasses. So Draba gramineae grows pretty much restricted to the alpine, depending on what resource you're looking at. It could potentially grow as low as 9,500 feet, but up to 13,000 feet. It's endemic, only found in the alpine of the San Juan Mountains. It's a G3S3, and it flowers July to August. Anna is another species that's restricted to the alpine. It grows in 15 counties of Colorado, and then it also occurs in the Culebra range of the Sangres in New Mexico. Another G3S3, and it flowers from late June to August. And then finally, we have Draba streptobrachia. So it grows from 10,800 feet to 13,000 feet. Grows in Colorado and possibly parts of New Mexico. Another G3S3 that flowers July through August. And there's a number of other more common yellow Draba species that occur in the alpine. And so if you're wondering, why are there so many yellow alpine Drabas, like rare or not? The answer is, I'm not entirely sure. Next, we have one of my favorites, Rothrock's Easter Daisy, Townsendia rothrockiae. Again, it's not exclusive to the alpine, but most of the known records on the Rio are above that 11,500 feet range. It's endemic to central and southwestern Colorado. It also really likes these dry, open, rocky places. Another G3S3 vulnerable species. It flowers from June to August. It has these cute little fleshy leaves. And what's hard to see, and I was trying to find a better picture, but the bracts are typically this reddish purple. Here they almost look black, that have those same dark pigments, those anthocyanins in the bracts below the flowers that are very indicative of this plant. And then finally, we have the alpine larkspur. Grows from 10,500 to 13,500. It also really likes gravelly, rocky areas. Grows from Colorado to northern New Mexico. It's a G3S2. So S2 is at moderate risk of becoming locally extinct. And it has, those typical delphinium larkspur flowers. But it's smaller and those flowers barely exceed the level of the leaves. Okay, so the Rio has so many alpine recreation opportunities and such a variety to allow for people of all interests and abilities to get into these really special landscapes. I think 14ers get a lot of attention for being really popular recreation areas, but we also have a lot of other alpine areas that see a lot of visitors, such as Stony Pass, which is is just where this photograph was taken. So you can do everything from a multi-day backpack trip in the wilderness. You can hike to an alpine lake to do some fishing. You can check off that list of 13ers and 14ers, or you can get kind of a more auto tour experience, such as this one on a 4x4 road, such as the one that goes from Rio Grande Reservoir over Stony Pass to Silverton. You can even ride your mountain bike or a motorized dirt bike over alpine trails such as Snow Mesa. And we want everybody to enjoy all of these experiences that the Rio has to offer, while also keeping in mind how fragile these systems are. So the Colorado 14ers initiative says that 5 footsteps by a human on an alpine plant could set back its development 5 to 10 years. and recovery following more serious trampling, or from something bigger like a vehicle or a motorized UTV or something, that can set plants back up to 20 years. These soils take a really long time to develop. Some of these plants are very old and take a long time to reproduce. So we can have not so great impacts on these plants. So some of the best practices, the biggest things are really just staying on the trail, or staying on the road. That's the best thing we can do, is just kind of leave these plants alone by staying on designated trails and designated roads. And then to also tread lightly, right? So it's no surprise that, many 13ers are now getting more attention, and many of them don't have established trails. So doing your best to stay on existing social trails instead of creating a new one, and just treading as lightly as possible, right? So stepping on rocks instead of these fragile cushion plants. And then, of course, packing in, packing out, including human waste, which isn't easy to bury in areas with really shallow soils. Resisting the urge to pull flowers. So, as I said, many of these species take many years to reproduce. Some of them only reproduce by seed. So by pulling flowers, we're reducing their potential to set viable seed and perpetuate into the future. And then finally, reporting any deteriorating road or trail conditions to district ranger office or to your local ranger district. Then finally, I just have a few photos to share with you all. So this is South Zapata Lake on the Saguache Ranger District. This photo was taken in October, so this is some fall wet meadow foliage pictured here. Next, we have a view from Caneos Peak, of the namesake of the Caneos Peak Ranger District. This is at about 13,000 feet in September. Here's a recreation opportunity that you have to either bike or drive or take your side-by-side up West Willow Creek towards the trailhead for San Luis Peak and down to Rat Creek. So here we can see where some people have gone off the road, kind of making incursions into this alpine turf community. These are all these little white speckles are that American bistort. Here's a view of the area near Beartown or Kite Lake on the Divide Ranger District in August. These photos were taken from Del Norte Peak in September at about 12,000 feet. This is Hymenopsis grandiflora. I think it's just so cute. It's kind of this big bobble-headed sunflower that grows up in the alpine. And then I know everybody likes the fall aspen colors, but for those willing to look closely, I think that our little fellfield community, our cushion plants, produce some really cool fall colors. And then finally, this is a picture of San Francisco Lake just below Bennett Peak, which is a 13er that can be accessed via a motorized trail. And I need to apologize because Brandon's here for the disproportionate number of photos I have from the Divide Ranger District. It is the largest district, but it's also closest to where I live. So in the future, I'll try and highlight some more of the gems from our other districts. And then finally, here's my list of resources. I want to give a nod to the Colorado Native Plant Society and Colorado Natural Heritage Program, who both have wonderful resources available if you want to learn more about alpine plants and alpine plant communities. A lot of the information was sourced from here, as well as the 14ers Initiative. Southwest Colorado Wildflowers has really awesome fun facts about a variety of plants that occur across Colorado. And then to the greater iNaturalist community, I tried to, in the most part, if the photos weren't mine, they came from iNaturalist observations on the Rio Grande National Forest. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for being here. Again, I'm by no means an expert, but is there any questions that you all might have? See if I can get out of this. Okay.
Rachel, that was great. Thank you so much for that. Um, I have a couple of questions. So you mentioned what is it? The Uncompahgre butterfly on the snow willow. Is that
Mhm.
right? So are they here in the Rio Grande National Forest, or are they mostly in other areas?
If I can, I might put Brandon on the spot since he's our wildlife biologist. I believe we have one known location on the forest. And I also believe that the snow willows occur more than the butterfly itself. But if Brandon wants to jump on and correct anything that I said, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, most of them are on the San Juan National Forest around actual Uncompahgre Peak, but there are a couple populations very close to each other on the Rio Grande National Forest and the La Garita Wilderness.
And is it
Thanks.
correct that similar to the bog violet, like you can find snow willow like all over, but that doesn't mean that you're gonna find the butterfly.
Yeah, that's right. I actually backpacked last weekend up to La Garita Wilderness, and there's like acres and acres of snow willow, but I didn't see any Uncompahgre fritillaries up there.
Okay, cool. Any other questions?
I actually had a question.
Okay.
Um, with the alpine habitat being much more difficult to access, do you think in general that alpine vegetation is understudied, or since it's so limited, it's been studied like proportionately pretty well?
That's a really good question. I guess like studied in terms of all plant studies. Is that what you mean? Just like in general?
Yeah, I guess like if you're looking for like scientific literature that's been published, is there quite a bit, or is it hard to find for like specific species?
So I found that it was kind of hard to find for specific species because I did want to take like a deep dive into one. And so I tried to do that with the Alpine forget-me-not, but a lot of the research was out of the European Alps instead of North America. But what I will say is that um, climate change is going to impact alpine environments quite a bit. And so there has been a lot of research on alpine plant communities and threats of climate change.
Awesome, thanks.
So Rachel, he messaged me asking if you could go back to the slide of Willow Creek and the trail numbers. Or maybe you could just, Jay, did you just want the trail numbers so that you could maybe go find them yourself? Was that
Yeah,
kind
exactly, please.
Yeah, let me go to it really quick. Um, okay, yeah, so West Willow Creek is Forest Service Road 503, which loops around to Rat Creek, which is Forest Service Road 505.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Great job. I enjoyed this.
thank you so much for being here.
Sure.
Yeah, we learned some good stuff. I didn't know that roots could be parasitic and like go after or take nutrients from other roots. That's
Isn't that wild?
eye-opening. That's crazy. So you also when you talked about the Alpine forget-me-nots, you talked about how they like in the glacial period they had these little pockets and then they started recolonizing. How do they do that? Is it like through seeds that get blown through the wind, or is it just kind of like, like aspen trees, or they just kind of spread?
Yeah, just slow dispersal over time. Yeah, so the Alpine forget-me-nots spread by seed. So, just think of a plant in your garden that drops its seeds that blow a little bit further and then grow some new seeds
Hmm.
that drop seeds that grow a little bit further. Yeah, just slowly over time.
Rachel, thank you so much. It was just really interesting, and I'm really grateful that you joined us, because I think you're more of an expert than you think you are, because that was really, really interesting stuff. So with that, I thank you all for joining us, and hope you all have a good night.